The light falls softly through the window, casting long shadows across the room. The air is thick with silence, broken only by the distant hum of the city. Colin Firth, sitting in the stillness, appears as if he's been frozen in time. At 68, his face carries the wisdom of a life fully lived, yet behind his eyes lies something darker, a sadness that even fame could not erase. He leans forward, his voice barely a whisper, yet it cuts through the room with chilling clarity. I will never forgive 5 people. The words hang in the air, heavy and unresolved. In that moment, the weight of decades spent under the public eye feels like nothing compared to the scars carried in silence. Who are these 5 faces he will never forget or forgive? The people who have left their mark on him, not with affection or admiration, but with betrayal and sorrow. These names have haunted him through the years, imprinted on his memory like an indelible ink. In a life so often under the spotlight, what could have possibly caused such lasting wounds? Was it a lover, a friend, a colleague, or something deeper? Perhaps an unseen betrayal that tore away the fabric of trust he once believed in? But who are these 5 faces he could never erase? The question lingers, casting a shadow over his reflections, as the room falls back into an eerie stillness, awaiting the stories of those who changed his life forever. Colin Firth's early years were far from the glitz and glamour of fame. Born in the quiet town of Grayshot, Hampshire, his childhood was shaped more by solitude than by the bustling world of city life. His father, a history professor, and his mother, a teacher, fostered an environment rich in intellect but devoid of emotional openness. The house was filled with books, lectures, and conversations that rarely ventured beyond the academic. In this space, emotions were often subdued, and affection was something unsaid. From a young age, Colin found comfort in quiet reflection rather than in socializing. His childhood was marked by a sense of isolation that wasn't born from neglect, but from a deeper, unspoken distance between him and those around him. His bond with his parents, though loving, was reserved. Their expressions of love were few, and the space between them often seemed vast. This distance left him yearning for connection, but also wary of it. It was in these formative years that Colin experienced his first true heartbreak, the betrayal of a close friend. This wasn't a dramatic or explosive act, but rather a quiet abandonment. The friend, once someone who shared everything with him, chose to leave him when Colin needed him most. It wasn't just the act itself that hurt, but the realization that the trust he had given so freely was not as valued as he had believed. The sting of that betrayal lingered, marking his transition from boyhood innocence to the more guarded man he would become. The feeling of being betrayed by someone close to him was a wound that would not heal easily. It planted within him the seeds of distrust, the notion that the world wasn't as kind or as dependable as he had once believed. From that point onward, Colin began to withdraw emotionally, carrying the weight of that early heartbreak and other small betrayals that followed. He learned that in a world where people could disappoint, it was safer to keep his distance, to protect himself from the pain of further hurt. This quiet isolation, shaped by early betrayals, would follow him through the years, influencing his relationships and the way he viewed the world. As Colin Firth's career began to take shape, the small town of Grayshot seemed a distant memory. The young man who once sat quietly in dark corners, observing the world around him, was now thrust into its glaring spotlight. In the 1980s, Colin moved to London to pursue his acting dreams, a city brimming with opportunities but also full of challenges. His early years in the theater were marked by small roles, but it was clear that there was something different about him, a quiet intensity that captivated those who saw beyond his reserved exterior. By the time the 1990s arrived, Colin had become a familiar face on screen. His breakthrough role in Pride and Prejudice in 1995 was nothing short of iconic, and it cemented his place as one of Britain's most beloved actors. The world knew him as the brooding, earnest Mr. Darcy, the perfect image of romantic heroism. The press adored him, and fans flocked to see him in everything he did. He was lauded for his depth and charm, with a career that seemed destined for greatness. But with this rise came an unspoken pressure, a heavy burden that would begin to take its toll. Collins smiled for the cameras, posed for the magazines, but behind the scenes, He was growing weary of the constant scrutiny. The fame he had worked so hard for now felt like a cage. He found himself trapped in the role of the perfect gentleman, a persona that had been so carefully crafted by both himself and the public. The constant attention, the invasive questions about his personal life, began to feel suffocating. While the world saw him as a success, Colin was starting to see the cracks in the glossy image. He would walk the red carpet, the flashing lights blinding him, and yet deep inside, he longed for the quiet, for the anonymity he once knew. The truth was, he was alone. Despite being surrounded by people, he felt disconnected, as if the more famous he became, the more distant he became from his true self. It wasn't long before the first signs of betrayal appeared. A colleague, someone he considered a friend, began to distance themselves, taking advantage of Colin's good nature. At first it was small things, an unreturned call, a forgotten commitment, but over time, it grew into something more. The trust he had placed in this person, the friendship that had seemed so genuine, began to unravel. For the first time in his career, Colin felt the sting of betrayal from someone he had once trusted implicitly. His world was beginning to shift. The fame, the success, the praise. It all felt hollow, like an elaborate performance where the curtain had just started to fall. He had worked so hard to achieve everything he had, but the price of success was beginning to show. It was in the midst of all the success, the red carpets and endless premieres, that Colin first felt the real sting of betrayal. Fame, which had once seemed like the ultimate goal, was now an overwhelming weight, a gilded cage from which there was no escape. Beneath the smiles, the public admiration, and the applause, the isolation began to grow. The first fracture came quietly, like the cracking of an old foundation that had been ignored for too long. A colleague, someone Colin had worked with closely for years, began to change. Their relationship, once built on mutual respect and camaraderie, started to feel strained. It began with small moments, broken promises, calls left unreturned, subtle hints of distance. Colin, always the professional, tried to brush it off, to convince himself that it was just a phase, just the natural ebb and flow of a career. But one day it became impossible to ignore. A promise once given was broken without a second thought. It wasn't just the betrayal of a friend, it was the complete disregard for the trust that had once bound them. Colin, ever the optimist, tried to reason with himself, but the harsh reality settled in. This person, someone who had been by his side through thick and thin, had chosen to walk away when it mattered most. In that moment, the walls that had been slowly building up inside him, walls he had long tried to keep down, came rushing back. Trust, he realized, was not something that could be given freely anymore. The world was not full of kind-hearted people. The line between friend and foe was thinner than he had ever imagined. The sting of this betrayal was unlike any other. It wasn't just the hurt of being left behind. It was the shock of realizing that even in a world where you're adored, loneliness can creep in unnoticed. The weight of it all was suffocating. The public persona, the smiling face, the actor who graced the big screens, all of it was beginning to feel more and more like a mask. And the more he wore it, the harder it became to breathe. Cinq noms, cinq blessures, cinq trahisons qu'il n'a jamais pu effacer. Each of these 5 people carries with them a story, a face, a name, a memory that Colin can never shake off, no matter how much time has passed. The scars they left behind are not physical but emotional, imprinted deep within him like an invisible tattoo. Personne. 1. The betrayed friend. The first person he cannot forgive is a friend, a man he had once called his closest companion. They had shared everything, laughter, secrets, and dreams of the future. Colin trusted him implicitly, opening his heart in ways he had never done with anyone else. But that trust was shattered in the cruelest of ways. The friend had promised to stand by him during a difficult time, but when the moment came, he turned his back. No explanation, no apology, just an absence where once there had been a presence. It wasn't the betrayal itself that hurt the most, but the realization that Colin had been blind to the truth for so long. That wound never healed. Personne 2. The colleague. The second person is a colleague, someone he had worked with for years. At first, they had a strong bond, built on mutual respect and admiration. But as their careers took off in different directions, jealousy crept in. The colleague, who once offered support and encouragement, began to subtly undermine Colin's success. It started with offhand comments, small digs that seemed innocuous at first, but gradually grew more cutting. Behind the scenes, this person worked to tarnish Colin's reputation, manipulating situations to their advantage. The betrayal stung, not because of the competition, but because Colin had believed this person to be a friend, someone who understood the pressures they both faced. Person 3. The family member. The third person is someone from his own family, a relative whose actions left Colin feeling deeply betrayed. The betrayal wasn't one of cruelty, but of indifference. This person, someone Colin had looked up to, had promised to support him during a critical moment in his life. But when Colin needed them the most, they chose to remain silent, offering no help, no guidance. It was as if the bond they had shared was meaningless in the face of personal convenience. The disappointment was profound. It wasn't just the lack of support, but the realization that even those closest to you can choose their own comfort over loyalty. Person. Schaffinerausser. The public. The fourth person is, in a way, the public itself. The very people who had built him up and then torn him down. Colin had always been aware of the fragile nature of fame, but he had never fully understood its power until the public turned on him. The press, once eager to praise him, now sought to expose every flaw, every misstep. The constant scrutiny became unbearable, and the weight of public opinion began to feel like a prison. The betrayal wasn't in the headlines, but in the way the public, whom he had given so much of himself to, had turned their backs when he was at his most vulnerable. It wasn't the cruelty of the press that hurt the most, but the sense of abandonment by the very people who once adored him. Person 5. Himself, and the fifth, the most painful of all, is himself. The greatest betrayal he has ever faced is the one he has inflicted on himself. Over the years, in his pursuit of success and approval, Colin had allowed himself to become something he wasn't. A man driven by the need to please others, to live up to the expectations placed upon him. He had sacrificed parts of himself, his true essence, in exchange for fame, for acceptance. And now, standing in the quiet of his own mind, he realized that he had betrayed his own soul. The person he had been before the fame, the boy from Grey Shot, was lost to him now, replaced by a persona he had created for the world. This betrayal, more than any other, hurt the most. It was not just the regret, but the knowledge that he had sacrificed his own identity in the name of ambition. Colin Firth's journey through life, the fame, the betrayal, the heartache, had brought him to a place of quiet solitude. As he sat in his study, the evening light beginning to fade, he reflected on the years that had shaped him. The faces of the 5 people he could never forgive lingered in his mind, but their presence was not as suffocating as it had once been. The bitterness that had consumed him for so long had started to fade, replaced by something more fragile, understanding. He had learned that holding on to resentment, to anger, was like clinging to a heavy burden, one that grew harder to carry as time passed. Yet forgiving, truly forgiving, was not as simple as letting go. It was a slow process, a quiet reckoning with the past, a realization that the person who had hurt him the most was, in fact, himself. Colin stood by the window, gazing out at the fading light. The world outside seemed distant, yet somehow familiar. The 5 faces, though still etched in his memory, no longer carried the same weight. The wounds they had inflicted no longer felt like open sores, but like scars, faded, healed in their own way, even if they would never disappear entirely. Can one really live without forgiving, he thought, his gaze lingering on the horizon? Or must we sometimes carry the pain, not to hold on to the hurt, but to remember that we have loved? In the silence of the room, the only sound was the soft ticking of the clock, and for the first time in a long while, Colin felt a quiet peace, knowing that sometimes the greatest act of forgiveness is the one we give to ourselves.